My name is John Scanny, and I work for Ippon Technologies out of the Richmond, USA office. And today I'm going to talk about API documentation languages and contract-first design. So I'll go over what documentation languages are and why you'd want to use them. We'll do a demo of one of them, and then we'll talk a little bit about contract-first design. Well, we refactor the demo with contract-first design in mind, and then I'll go over a list of some of the cool tools that I have found. So to set up the context, here's an example of an API that we might need to document. We have a product resource. So here, defining the location of the collection of products, we support HTTP methods, get and post to get all the products and add a new product to the collection. And we have a URL parameter ID to get a product by ID. So that is an example of an API that we might want to document. There are several ways to document your API. API documentation languages is one of them. So what an API documentation language is it defines a specification. So specifications are machine readable. The cool thing about that is that parsers and tools that understand the specification in which your documentation is written in can parse your API documentation and give you some cool features. And I'll go over examples in a minute. So the specifications, the best specifications, there's a number of them out there, are open source, and then that enables third-party developers to build on top, build parsers, and build tools to give you that added value. So some of the examples of the tools that are out there are interactive documentation, code generation, Postman collections, mock servers, traffic. There's a long list here. So and there's more. So when I first started looking into API documentation languages, I started to realize that there's two ways to go about using them. The first way is where you write your documentation language first, and you use your documentation to generate your server-side code or your implementation. This approach is called the top-down or contract-first approach. The other approach is when you write your code first, or maybe you have your code already written at this point and you need to have documentation. Well, there's tools out there where you add a few annotations, and that then you hit a button and they will automatically generate documentation that follow a specification. And once you have that documentation, you can apply a number of other tools and parsers to that. So there's three kind of major languages out there that I kind of noticed out in the open source community: Swagger, RAML, and API Blueprint. Swagger is the oldest, and it did a really good job at the code first approach. But within the last year or so, there's been more of a trend for contract first, or having more value on making sure your contract is right before you write any server-side code. So RAML and API Blueprint address this need, and they design their specification from scratch with that in mind. And if you go down to the formats, you'll notice that RAML and API Blueprint use human-readable and writable formats. Swagger, the core of Swagger is written in JSON, but there's Apogee wrote a editor on top of Swagger that's written in YAML. So that's why I have the with YAML comment there. And that's with Swagger 2.0, which has come out to address some of the things that RAML and API Blueprint have done well. So community support here is really where the value comes from, and Swagger has been out the longest, and it has a really powerful lead on the number of tools and number of parsers and generators that are out there. This number here at the bottom is the number of stars on their most favorite GitHub post, or GitHub repository. But if you look at things like Stack Overflow questions, you'll find similar numbers or similar ratios. So to kind of place a constraint here, I'm only interested in documenting REST APIs right now. All three of these support the core of REST and the core of HTTP. Authentication, all three support major security flows. File inclusions are really useful for organizing a large API for a writer, for someone writing the API. So RAML does a really good job at that. Swagger kind of supports it, but it's not the main use case. It's not very well supported. Sample representations is very interesting because not only does it help with the documentation for people to help understand, here's an example of something that you could pass or something, an example of something that you might receive in a response. It also helps because it provides input for mock servers. So basically you can click a button and start a mock server based on a RAML or API blueprint documentation, and then it will return sample representations as the body of the responses. And this is without even having any server-side code written. This is the number of the language integration. Swagger has very good support for both server-side and client-side. So now I'm going to go into the demo. For the demo, I'm going to use RAML to document this pet store API. We're going to support getting all the pets, adding a new pet to the pet store, getting a pet by ID. We're also going to look at how to solve paging and security. So a cool thing about RAML is that it has this little toolbox that tells me what I can do. But first I need to specify a title, store API. And then at the root context, these are all the things that I can do. So I can do a base URI and a version. I can also define protocols. And then that's all I want to do for now. I can do a couple other things like define external documentation. But I'm going to go ahead and add a new resource. And our new resource is going to be pets, display name pets. And now that the context has changed, it's giving me a bunch of other options for defining HTTP methods. So I'm going to do a get. And the descriptions support Markdown, so I can do some Markdown, get all pets, and then I'm going to define a response. It's going to be a 200 with a body, application JSON, an example here. And this is going to return an array of pets. So our pet object is going to have two properties, a name and an ID. So now that I'll shift tab all the way back here to get back to my methods, I'm going to define a post so we can add a new pet to the collection. And I'm going to define a body for this, which is going to take application JSON, and I'm going to define a schema here. And I externally defined the schema already. And you can see here's the file support with RAML. And so here's my schema. It's defined a JSON schema. They also have support for XSD. So here I have two properties, and with a name and an ID, both required. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull that into my, into my API. Pet store pet.schema. And okay, so for this I'm going to define a response, 200 response with a body that's going to be application JSON with an example. That's going to be a simple JSON object that just returns a message that says your pet has been added. Alright, so I list all the pets and I added a new pet to the collection. So now I'm going to define a sub-resource for the URL parameter. And I'm just going to put an ID here, a variable, pets by ID. We'll do a get. with the responses will be 200 with the body and application JSON. Hello. Example. Example will be your, oh no, it's going to return a pet. And we're also going to find a 404 here because we could be passing an ID for a pet that doesn't exist. So application JSON with an example, and we're going to just do a simple message for pet not found. Okay, there's my get pet by ID. Expand that. So one thing I want to define for my get is paging. So to do paging, we're going to implement two query parameters, an offset and a limit, and this will control the size of the payload that comes back in case our pet store is really huge and we have a lot of pets. So we'll define some query parameters here. We'll have a limit and an offset, and then for each of these we'll define defaults, requireds, field, an example, and a type. And the default for limit 0 doesn't make sense, so let's change that. Okay, so there's our paging. We support it with query parameters, two query parameters, limit and offset, and with those we should have good paging support. So before I go into defining security, I want to take a look at what our specification has generated so far in the preview mode. So if we weren't so far zoomed in for the purpose of this demonstration, you could use the editor and the preview mode side by side, and this screen would update in real time. So we have our pets collection resource here, and we are pets by ID. Two methods, post and get. So post, for example, we have a request, add a pet to the collection, our body, a response 200 with the example that we provided, and a content type. So one of the cool things about RAML is that you can hook up a mock server within the editor itself. So by default, if you don't turn on the mocking service, it will, if you have a server deployed at the endpoint that you specified, it will actually send HTTP requests, and you can interact with your server. But if you might not have a server implementation, especially if you're doing contract first design, so you turn on this mocking service, and MuleSoft will deploy a mock service in their cloud that this is a public URL, anyone can access it right now, and that acts for a serving point for my API. So now I can do this try it, and I can pass in a new pet that I want to create. And so I had the schema defined, and I needed to have the name and the ID. So the mock server is smart enough to return 400. Your ID is not required, or your ID is required. So we'll go ahead and fix that. And add an ID, post. And now that we have our schemas, we conform to our schema, we get a 200 response with your pet has been added, which is the example that we defined in our documentation.
So a little history about these API documentation languages that I picked out. Swagger is the oldest of the three, and came out in 2011, and it addressed the problem of a code-first approach and automatically generating your documentation from annotations that you put in your code. But within the last year or so, there's been more of a push for contract-first design. And RAML and API Blueprint have been created to address that need. RAML is quoted here to talk about Swagger as was best suited for documenting an existing API, not for designing an API from scratch. Swagger 2.0, it has addressed some of the problems that it has faced, and it came out recently, September 2014, to address some of its deficiency in a contract-first design approach. So why contract-first design? The contract-first design came about because we realized that our APIs and our contracts are valuable. Our APIs enable internal developers and third-party developers to do good things with the data that we expose. And a clean API and a well-thought-of contract that is designed per the consumer use cases will result in cleaner code and higher adoption rates, which ultimately drives value back to our service. So here's an example of where we didn't think about the contract before we exposed our API to our consumer. Here we have an application, and with any application, there's a complicated data model and wonky business logic that acts on that data. And we decide we're going to draw a line and expose an API, and we're going to expose those things to the consumers. Obviously, this is not the optimal approach. We don't consider the needs of the consumers in this case, and we expose to them the complicated models and the unfriendly business logic that we shouldn't have to expose to them directly. Also, consumers might have a different view of the world than what's defined by our data. So here's a better approach. Introduce a facade or protection layer between your application and the consumers. And the facade will hide the complexity of your application, and it will basically, you want to define the user-facing API to something that the users want to use, and then you adapt that to talk to your application. And the API is going to have simple models and consistent interfaces that are great to use for the consumers. So one great way of building a contract-first design is to get feedback from your consumers, because you're building it for them, so you want them to tell you how to do it. So here you can create an API and collect feedback from your consumers, and then you iterate on that design. So with a strong emphasis on contract-first design, I went back and I looked at some of the specific things in each of the 3 documentation languages that I looked at about contract-first design. So first one is language writability. All 3 of them are really good, especially with the YAML editor now provided by Apogee that works on top of Swagger. Mock server is really important, I think, because when you want to iterate and iterate on your design and collect feedback from your consumers, a mock server can do that, so you can quickly build prototypes without spending time actually creating a server application. So one thing I want to look at here is reusable patterns. There's a lot of patterns that we use over and over again in REST interfaces. We use, for example, get my collection will return the list of items in the collection. Post to my collection will post a new item to the collection. And we solve filtering, ordering, and paging with similar patterns as well. So there's got to be a way to kind of make it so that we don't have to redefine these things over and over again. And this is one of the things that RAML does really well. They have definitions for resource types and traits. Resource types define common behaviors for a resource, and traits define common behaviors for methods. So here's an example of our resource of pets. We define it as a type collection, and then in that resource type collection, we will define the things that apply universally to every collection. All right, so now let's take a look at how these key features in RAML can affect our demo. So first thing, I have global resource types.yaml, where I define a collection and a collection item. In the collection, I have a get and a post.
And the get and the post is we've already implemented it already. So the get a list of all of the resources, post, add a new resource to the collection. Resource types takes parameters. The resource path name parameter is a reserved parameter that just pulls in whatever the resource is that you're applying it to. But you can also define user-defined parameters. So example collection is something that you want to pass in, as well as collection schema. Also global traits. I defined a paged trait, which defines the two query parameters offset and limit that we used earlier. So let's refactor. The first thing I want to do is I want to pull in the resource types so I can use them in this file. And then I want to define the traits. So now I can use these resource types and traits throughout my API. So we have it's about 35 lines of code for this pets collection resource. And we're going to delete all of it. We'll define it as a type, collection, and I need an example collection parameter, which will be include pet store-pets.example. And I also need a collection schema, which I also have externally defined. Okay. Can't spell pet store. Pet store-pets.schema. Pet.schema. Okay. And then, so the get on this collection is going to be paged. So if I specify a get here, it will combine with the get that I defined in the resource type. So I just need to add is paged to pull in the trait. For our get pet by ID, we can delete all this and say specify the type as a collection item. And then we need to provide an example item, which will be pulled in pet store dash pet dot example. All right, so we went from, it was actually about 60 lines total to about 50 lines, about 50 lines total to about 10. And by externalizing these traits and resources in a global file, we can apply these to several of our different API definitions.
So my takeaway of the 3 API documentation languages is that Swagger has an overwhelming hold on the community and has extensive language support for both client-side and server-side. But with the new RAML, it better addresses contract-first design, and especially those reuse patterns, which will prevent you from redefining those patterns over and over again. It also has better support for multiple files, and it's just better in general for designing APIs where you're writing the contract first. API Blueprint has kind of the best of both worlds. It has a lot of the community support, a lot more than RAML, and it also has a good contract first design where you're writing your API documentations in Markdown instead of YAML. So keep an eye out for community growth in RAML as well as more of a contract first design approach in Swagger. And I highly encourage everyone to follow them. Even if you're not ready to adopt these languages today, keep an eye out, because I think this is definitely going to be something that you will want to do in the future when these technologies are a little bit more mature. So last part of my presentation, I want to talk about some of the tools that I found. Client SDK Generator, this is the Swagger GitHub project to automatically generate code for all of your client projects, and it has at least 6-7 different languages that it supports right now. RAML API Designer with MongoDB. This is for if you wanted to deploy RAML standalone, the API editor I showed you today. You'll want to look into this project for a persistence layer. Enterprise solutions, RAML and API Blueprint have their own enterprise solutions, so look into that for kind of API management / console. Verify code. So you're going to want to make sure that your code is the same as your documentation. This is especially important in a contract first design approach. So there's command line tools, ABOA and Dread for RAML and API Blueprint respectively, that you can integrate into your continuous integration, and it will fail your build if your documentation is not up to date. API mashups. This is a really cool project that RAML's done, where it is basically a live JavaScript app, and you can quickly create prototypes. As a client, you can quickly create prototypes using multiple APIs and create applications, so an API mashup. And all of your work is saved as a GitHub gist. Postman supports both RAML and Swagger. You can get Sublime plugins for API Blueprint and RAML. And there's a HTML generator for RAML. And that is it.